The morning the sky turned to copper, the town of Ellensburg gathered like buzzards around a fresh kill. Heat shimmered off the dusty main street, and in the stillness, the sound of boots crunching gravel echoed like judgment. At the center of it all stood a girl, barefoot, bloodied, and tied to the whipping post as if she were a lesson carved from flesh. Clara May Callahan, 19, with defiance still glowing in her wildfire eyes, did not cry. No one spoke her name. Not the women clutching their aprons, not the preacher watching from the shade of his chapel porch, and certainly not the sheriff who stood with a leather strap coiled in his hand, looking more like a tired man than a cruel one. But tired men still follow orders. Especially when those orders come from the likes of Ephraim Callahan and Luther Cobb. Ephraim, Clara's uncle, leaned against the rail of the saloon, arms folded across his gut, jaw set like stone. He didn't look at her. She was just a bargaining chip that had turned to dust in his fingers. When Luther Cobb had offered him 80 acres in exchange for the girl's hand, Ephraim had nodded like a man signing a deed. But Clara had spit on Luther's boots, called him a swine in a waistcoat, and slammed the door on the deal, and on her fate. Luther, red-faced and twitching with insult, didn't waste time seeking a preacher. He went straight to Sheriff Hale. "She's a wild thing," he'd said. "Needs taming. If law won't do it, the lash will." And so here they were, the town assembled not in anger, but in quiet, practiced complicity. Whispers curled in the air like wood smoke. Brought it on herself. Unruly. Wouldn't be in this fix if she knew her place. The sheriff raised his hand. The strap hissed through the air and cracked against Clara's back. Her body jolted, but her face remained stone. The second blow split her shoulder. The third brought blood that ran in thin lines, glistening in the morning sun like ink spilled across parchment. Children watched with wide eyes. Women looked away. Men shuffled uneasily, but none moved. In the far shadow of the blacksmith's awning stood Silas Boone. He'd returned to town only once since his wife and son were killed in the border raid 3 years ago. They said he buried them without weeping and rode home that same night. Since then, no one had seen him speak more than 5 words in a row. He kept to himself, high up in the canyons where only the wind and horses knew his grief. Now he stood like a ghost come down from the cliffs, tall, broad-shouldered, sun-darkened. His hat was low over his brow, shadowing a face carved by silence. He watched as the strap landed again and again, the girl trembling now, lips pressed white but still unbroken. She would not scream. That, more than her refusal, was what unsettled the town. By the 7th lash, the sheriff's arm faltered. Clara's knees gave. She slumped, cheek to the post, hair covering half her face. The strap fell once more. Then it was over. No one cheered. There were no words of correction, no sermons. Only the creak of boots dispersing and the soft moan of wind brushing through dry branches. Clara was left in the dirt like a thing discarded. Ephraim turned his back. Luther lit a cigar and sauntered off, victorious in all but spirit. The sheriff, jaw tight, walked away with the guilt of law on his shoulders. She lay there until dusk. The sun had softened, the sky blushing lavender and fire when Silas stepped from the shadows. He didn't speak. He didn't kneel or offer comfort in words. He simply removed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Clara flinched, unsure whether the touch meant more pain or mercy. When her eyes met his, she saw not pity, but stillness, like a lake undisturbed by stone or storm. He lifted her gently. She was light, all bone and bruises now. One hand clutched the coat to her chest, the other rested against his collarbone, unsure. They passed the saloon. No one looked out. They passed the church, shuttered and silent. They passed Ephraim's ranch house, and its lantern glowed, but no door opened. No voice called after her. The sheriff's door creaked open as they reached the edge of town. He stepped out, face pale. "You taking her?" he asked. Silas did not answer. "She's still under town protection, technically." Still no answer. "You'll be marked for it." Silas looked at the sheriff then, just once. No threat, no request. Just a kind of quiet finality. The sheriff stepped aside. The wind stirred his coat. Then he closed the door and didn't look again. They rode out without saddlebags, without farewells. Clara leaned into him as the horse climbed westward, her lashes heavy with exhaustion. The land stretched endless, painted gold and violet by the sinking sun. She thought she might sleep, but part of her feared waking up back in that dirt, her refusal still punished. She shifted in the saddle, wincing, but Silas's arm held her steady. His silence felt vast, but not empty. It felt like space to breathe. They stopped only once, at a rise overlooking the whole of Ellensburg. From there, the town looked small, almost false. A handful of roofs trying to play civilization in a wilderness too wide to tame. She looked down at it and whispered, "They'll come after me." Silas didn't speak. But he handed her the canteen, and for some reason, that was enough. Later, she would remember that moment as the beginning, not of romance, not of salvation, but of something slower, quieter. The first time someone didn't try to break her spirit or bargain for her skin. The first time she was not told who to be, but simply allowed. By nightfall, the town lights were long gone behind them, swallowed by hills. And as the stars came out like lanterns hung by angels, Clara leaned her head against the stranger's chest and let her eyes close. She had no name for what had happened that day, but she knew this. Something had been taken from her in that town. But something else, something fragile, unknown, had just begun to take root. And she wasn't sure what waited at the end of this trail, but for the first time in her life, she didn't want to turn back. The mountains received her like an old friend. Wind moved through the pines like a hymn, low and solemn. Clara woke in a strange bed with walls that creaked in the night, but no voices pressed upon her. No footsteps came with demands. She blinked against the light filtering through burlap curtains and tried to rise, but pain anchored her back. The lashes had scabbed into ridges, angry and raw. Silas was outside, splitting wood in a rhythm so steady it might have been mistaken for silence. She watched through the window, the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the way he never paused to look toward the cabin. There was no performance in him. He existed like a mountain, present and unmoved. Days passed in fragments. She woke to find a cup of broth beside her, steam curling upward like smoke from a campfire. At night, he sat by the hearth, reading aloud in a voice sanded by time. Not stories of heroes or gunfights, but poems about rivers and wind and people who lost their way and found it again in the stillness. He never asked what had happened. Not once. At first, she thought it indifference, but then she noticed the small things, the way he placed her boots beside the fire to warm, the way he'd positioned her bed to catch morning sun. When her hands shook while spooning stew, he said nothing, just quietly refilled the bowl and looked away. Clara did not speak much either. Words had always been sharpened against her, tools to command, to scold, to sell her future like a crate of dried goods. Here, there was no need to explain. The silence between them became a strange comfort, an understanding deeper than speech. She learned to read his moods through the slope of his shoulders, the way he held his coffee. Some mornings he was heavy with sorrow, eyes fixed on nothing. Others, he was light-footed, almost boyish in the way he hummed while brushing the horses. His grief lived in the corners of his life, never named, but always there. Clara found herself healing, not just in skin, but in shape. She began to move differently. With no one watching, no one controlling, her spine lengthened, her breath deepened. She fed the chickens, drew water, watched deer descend to drink from the stream in the amber hush before sunset. Then came the letter. She found it folded on the porch bench one morning, sealed with the sheriff's mark, carried up the trail by someone she hadn't seen. Her fingers trembled before she opened it. The words inside were sharp. Town demands her return. By law, her uncle's custody still holds. She must answer for her flight. Clara read it 3 times. She didn't weep. She didn't scream. She folded the paper, placed it in the fire, and watched it burn. That night she didn't sleep. In the early dark, she stepped outside to find Silas already saddling her horse. A second bag was beside it, dried meat, bread, coins, a blanket, a compass. He stood with his back to her, jaw clenched. "You want me gone," she said softly. He didn't turn. "You need to be free." She stared at the horse, at the way the saddle had been tightened with care, the reins oiled, the bit gentle. Everything he did had always been gentle. She stepped closer. "They won't stop, will they?" He shook his head. "Not until they think they've owned you." Clara looked out at the path. She could follow it, disappear west into nameless country. But she'd be running again. Always running. "What about here?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Just tightened the strap and stepped back. She looked at him then, truly looked. Not at the scars he bore, not at the silence he wore like armor, but at the man who had nursed her without asking for a thing, who had let her break in peace. She reached for the saddle, but instead of mounting, she pulled the pack free, slung it over her shoulder, and walked past him toward the cabin. "You're letting me choose," she said. His voice was gravel. "Always." The days that followed passed without discussion. They didn't talk about the letter again. Didn't speak of what was decided. But a slow shift settled in, like thaw after a long freeze. Silas carved a second chair for the porch. Clara painted the shutters blue. She began to laugh again, not loud, but enough to stir the birds. One afternoon, as rain softened the dust outside, he sat beside her and handed her a book. Inside the cover, her name was written in his handwriting. Just that, Clara. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. Later, the sheriff rode up. Alone, hat in hand, face lined with apology. He didn't enter the cabin. Just called from the yard. "I'm not here for her," he said. "I'm here to say she's no longer their concern. The town's tired. Cobb's moved east. Ephraim sold the land and vanished. No one's asking questions anymore." Silas nodded. The sheriff didn't stay. He tipped his hat toward Clara, who stood in the doorway, and rode off into the trees. When night came, she sat on the porch while Silas tended the fire. The stars were thick above them, heavy with light. She turned to him, something full and warm pressing behind her ribs. "You don't speak much," she said. "But you listened better than any man ever did." He looked at her then, truly looked, the way she had looked at him that morning by the horse. "Some things don't need words." She leaned into him. Not as someone broken, not as a woman rescued, but as herself, fully formed at last. In the silence they found something deeper than love. Not lightning-struck passion. Not declarations shouted under rain. But two lives braided together through quiet, steady hands and mornings shared over black coffee. And though the wind still whispered of old wounds, though the world still watched women with judgment sharpened on their tongues, Clara had found one truth worth holding to. She was not saved. She was seen. And that, at last, was enough.